Here with an episode of Chordplay, and this is the Chords of Steely Dan. And Steely Dan was formed by Walter Becker and Donald Fagen in 1972 in New York. And historically, Steely Dan definitely has a history of introducing, jazz tonalities and chords and progressions to rock music fans. And that was kind of their kind of secret or hidden strategy, was writing, pop and rock music, but injecting it full of jazz harmony, jazz tonalities, progressions, and all these things that you frequently hear in jazz and fusion music. But then suddenly it popped up on FM radio and, album charts and things like that, the Billboard charts. And definitely, Steely Dan has a long history of releasing all of this music and collaborating with all these very, important and inspiring, musicians. And just on the guitar front, when you look at people like Jeff Skunk Baxter and Elliott Randall and Larry Carlton and Jay Graydon, Hiram Bullock, Rick Derringer. There's a whole bunch of guitarists that have worked with, Steely Dan either in the recording studio or on stage. And it's a very, inspiring band to kind of tap into if you're not really hip to their music, or maybe you're kind of coming to terms with some of these complex, tonalities and harmony and progressions that you find in Steely Dan's music, which you can directly relate that to jazz. Whether you're already an established fan or maybe you're kind of a newcomer to Steely Dan's music, there's a ton of chords in this lesson. Interesting shapes, unusual progressions, and movements. And we're going to look at mu chords, which is kind of the Steely Dan, nickname for a series of chords that appear in a lot of their songs. And we're going to look at, scattered, famous hits and moments from Steely Dan's music. So here we go. The opening, that was the very famous Steely Dan song, Josie. And I know I first learned this when I was in school in Atlanta at AIM. And one of my instructors at AIM, Bill Hart, he used to play this like during class all the time. He would just sit there and all of a sudden you'd hear Josie, just appear. But really interesting, guitar part. And the tonalities, even just right off the bat, are very different. It's not your normal like 3-chord progression or, power chords, even though there are some 5 chords and power chords hiding here, but they're arranged and played in a very unusual way. So we're starting with this kind of E minor 7. And it's like a little piece of like an F sharp 5 there, but played that way. And then you're going to play an E flat 5 to an E5. And then repeat that again. E flat 5, and then a B5 to a D5. So it's really unusual. And this little chromatic thing. And then the first kind of weird chord. So that's basically like an F over C. Or I'm sorry, a C over F. And then right here, you're playing an F sharp 7 sharp 9. And then that's going to be answered with this D over G. And then an A flat 13. A flat major 13. So that's a very demanding series of chords right there. And it's mainly the fingering, it makes that very tricky. You have to kind of move, each chord has a radically different fingering. So you really have to watch your fingers as you play that progression. And notice I'm putting, a pause and speaking between the chords. So you might want to practice it like that until you kind of get used to that movement. Really unusual. And then when the verse kicks off, he's really just playing part of an E minor 7 chord. And then during the song, you'll actually hear it shift and it changes to an A9. And we're just moving that D note back to a C sharp, changing the root note to an A. really crafty, you know, just that kind of one note changes between that E minor 7 and A9. You know, and that's one thing that Steely Dan is very skilled at, are these little kind of interesting and intelligently performed, you know, chords and sequences of chords. And that one little movement right there is kind of a Steely Dan-ism in a way. You know, where we're changing that one chord type just by changing one note. Really cool. Now at the end of the chorus from Josie, you can definitely hear this really kind of standard, you know, jazz progression, but in a pop or a rock tune, it's, you know, kind of foreign territory or unusual territory to hear, you know, in a rock song. But in jazz, you'd hear this every day, all day. But this section is like an A minor 7 right here to a D9, and then G major 7 to C major 7. And then right here, we're gonna basically play an F sharp 7 sharp 9. And then right there, it's a B7 sharp 5 sharp 9. So really interesting, you know, series of chords. And just kind of moving your way back into that verse again. But one more time there. Section of this lesson, we're going to talk about mu chords, and that's like a cow, mu, but it's spelled M-U, and this is the Steely Dan chord, basically, or what they've nicknamed mu chords. And I know when I first heard that term, I just thought, what is that? You know, it must be some secret, you know, highly classified secret, you know, chord in Steely Dan's arsenal. And they're basically talking about add 9 chords. And it took me a little while to realize that it was kind of the same thing. And we've talked about add 9 chords, you know, in several Chordplay episodes, and I've also talked about them like in the creative chord, you know, episode and some other lessons here on this channel. But add 9 chords are very popular, you know, in rock and metal. You hear them in classical and jazz and a lot of different styles of music. But in Steely Dan's universe, they are kind of treated a little bit differently, arranged a little bit differently. So just to kind of give you an overview of what we're talking about, think of just standard cowboy chords to start with, so we can find, you know, the tonality or the chord type. So just think of like an E major cowboy chord right here. And to create, you know, an E major add 9, we're going to basically relocate this E note there on the 2nd fret on the D up to an F sharp, which would be the 9th in the key of E. There's E major add 9. We could do the same thing with an A major chord. You know, there's A major, just raise that A up to a B, which would be the 9th in the key of A. And there's an A major add 9. Here's D major. Take that D note, move it up to an E, and now you're playing, you know, a D add 9. Now, so those are very common, you know, and popular chords for sure. But those aren't really the way that Steely Dan would use those chords. That's the right chord type, just not really the right voicing. Now think of Jimi Hendrix, you know, Castles Made of Sand, and like the intro. You know, that kind of sound, but we're doing it, you know, here in the key of A. And another Steely Dan kind of approved voicing would be basically an A major 7 sus2, which would look like that. So I don't want you to get those two chords confused. You know, there's the A major add 9, and then an A major 7 sus2. With that major 7 sus2 voicing, you know, this one, we can basically pinpoint green earrings and that kind of really, you know, familiar intro part. basically what they're playing there in the intro. You know, that would be an E major 7 sus2 to a D major 7 sus2. And then D major 7 sus2 to C major 7 sus2. You know, that kind of thing. You know, very jazzy sound for sure. But I really like those chords. For another Steely Dan approved kind of mutation with these chords, you know, if we go back to this major add 9 shape that we started with a minute ago there, and if we take that and basically modify the C sharp to a C natural, that's going to change that to an A minor add 9. Really like that chord. That's just screaming to me, you know, write a song with me. You know, that's definitely a really cool chord. And we could also change and kind of refinger, you know, those chord ideas to something like this. And this is something that Steely Dan does a lot. And they'll end up putting the third in the bass in some of their chords. And this would be, you know, A major add 9 over C sharp. Third, that C sharp is functioning as the root or the bass note. And now the root note's actually on top, that A way up there. And we can modify that and change that C sharp to C natural. And now it's an A minor add 9 over C. You know, I really like that chord too. Very moody and kind of disturbing, but I like it. The next example comes from the song Black Cow, and this is using these kind of bluesy sixths where they're sliding the sixth chord around in the beginning, and then there's a really interesting, you know, series of chords after that. Something like this. See, we're kind of sliding the C6 to a B flat 6. You know, very common in blues for sure. And then you're going to hear that followed with this. That's an A7 sharp 5. And then basically a C over D. F7 sharp 9, like the Hendrix chord. And then a D sharp major 9. So that right there definitely has a signature, you know, Steely Dan flavor. You know, the Hendrix chord, the 7 sharp 9, followed by, you know, a major 9 chord. You know, very common in Steely Dan's music for sure. Examples from the very famous song Peg, and I was just talking about the Steely Dan kind of connection between those chords, and we're going to find that during the intro. And the intro, it's really just this kind of cascading sequence of chords that descend by half steps, like this. Up here there's a G major 9 and then an F sharp 7 sharp 9, you know, the Hendrix chord, and then an F major 9 followed by an E7 sharp 9, the Hendrix chord again, and an E flat major 9 followed by a D7 sharp 9. So there's this interesting little, you know, movement between the major 9 and the 7 sharp 9 chords right there. And it's actually a good exercise for your third finger and pinky if you're still having a little bit of trouble, you know, controlling those fingers and kind of developing some more dexterity and strength. It's actually a really good, you know, chord exercise for those fingers, because that's honestly the only part of the chord that's changing is what your third and pinky are holding down there. And for another chord workout like that, just look at the verse part from Peg. And there you'll see we're going to be doing a major 7th chord down to a minor 7 sharp 5. So there's C major 7 to a B minor 7 sharp 5, like this. So when you hear that verse kind of chime in after the intro, which I'm playing that way too fast there, but the very next thing you hear when that verse starts, you'll hear that little exchange between the C major 7 and B minor 7 sharp 5, and then you're going to hear it again in F. So there's F major 7, and then basically E minor 7 sharp 5. And then the last time there's G major 7, or I'm sorry, G major 7, and then an F sharp minor 7 sharp 5, and then F major 7, E minor 7 sharp 5, and then end up back on that C major 7 and B minor 7 sharp 5. So it's the same 2 chords, but arranged in 3 different, locations or keys. Here, based around C major 7. Here, based around that F major 7, and then here, based around G major 7. So that's really interesting to kind of tap into those chords and notice that little 2 chord, movement or exchange. All right, that's going to wrap this brief look at the chords of Steely Dan, and definitely there's a mountain of information you can kind of acquire and take on, from studying Steely Dan's music. It's kind of interesting to, notice a group like that wrote rock and pop songs that are, hits on the radio. You can still hear, Reelin' in the Years and Ricky Don't Lose That Number and some of those songs on the radio right now. But it's interesting to notice that they were technically jazz musicians and injecting their songs with all these jazz ideas, but then wrote and recorded them to kind of appeal to pop and rock, music fans and listeners. And definitely, I've met a lot of musicians, over the years that are huge Steely Dan fans, whether they were drummers or horn players, keyboardists, guitarists, bassists. Definitely a very well received and popular group and very respected. Steely Dan is still very respected. And it's very sad, Walter Becker passed away. Definitely it was kind of a shock, when that happened. It was like, oh man, there's the end of an era, And it is sad, but their music lives on, and definitely, support Donald Fagen. If he starts doing some solo recordings or collaborations, support what he does because he's brilliant as well. So anyway, leave some feedback and some comments. Please subscribe to Late Night Lessons, and I'll be back before you know with more content and material. Thank you.